Hi, everybody. So I'm actually going to, was frantically, this is an amazing group, and it's been an amazing series of panels, so I was frantically rewriting my talk last night, which, as we all know, is the best thing you can possibly do. So I don't actually, that's why I'm reading it off of my phone, because I've been changing it. So it's a huge pleasure to address you all today. And I am indeed going to be trying to take you on a strange journey that in this case is going to start on the MIT campus in 1968 and end up somewhere in the constellation of Libra around the solar system Gliese 581. So with that as a starting point, one of the reasons why I'm so keyed up and anxious is not just that I'm addressing this amazing group of people, but also that I've been given the verb to communicate. Because communication, is laden with fundamentally positive overtones. To share, to have in common, to commune. I am not a fan of fuzzy, spacious, positive, abstract nouns and verbs. They're somewhere between difficult and impossible to think clearly about. People mean very different things by them. And I want to start with an extremely fuzzy, positive, spacious version of the use of communication. The computer as communication device. J.C.R. Licklider, Robert W. Taylor. This is the paper where Licklider elaborated on the fundamental insight that he'd been working on since the late 1950s. Licklider had already apprehended something quite profound, that the utility of computing lay in collaboration with humans rather than the execution of tasks. What Engelbart would call augmentation, what Licklider called symbiosis. That is, not simply executing set tasks, but providing insight into complex systems that would not otherwise be available to human operators. Then he'd gone a step further. The really significant development was the connection between the augmented people and the machines on a larger network. The flow, he wrote, of metal and ideas and of flexibility and change, which is such an extraordinarily peculiar statement to run across in the world of military-funded computer science that I had to actually put it up on the screen. His vision of computing is all about time sharing and resource sharing, the flow of metal and ideas and of flexibility and change. That's like a Latourian phrase. So it's to say, time sharing and resource sharing, the genesis, not just of communication in the sense in which Norbert Wiener means it in the title of this famous document, but of new orders of community, new ways to pool and share resources. So Licklider and Taylor are making their case. Where computing really comes into significance is as a mode of communication. But first they have to make this clear. A communications engineer thinks of communicating as transferring information from one point to another in codes and signals. And that's not what they mean by communication. They don't mean this. They're trying to get at something else. Our emphasis on people is deliberate, they write. To communicate is more than to send and to receive. Do two tape recorders communicate when they play to each other and record from each other? Not really, not in our sense. This is one of the only times I'm going to read you a quote that's also on a slide. It's just that this is very key to this argument. We believe that communicators have to do something non-trivial with the information that they send and receive. They talk about the richness of living information, about being active participants, about minds interacting. These are all quotes. Active participants, richness of living information, minds interacting. You can tell from my tone of voice how I feel about some of these statements, about the creative aspects that, and I quote, transcend the transmission of information. What this turns out to mean for them in practice is how useful computers are for producing models that people can manipulate in real time over the network. By communication, they mean the comparison of mental models, which might seem like rather weak sauce after all of that build-up, transcendence and all the rest of it. But they're struggling with a term whose meaning has been largely evacuated. What, after all, does it mean to communicate? The deepest responses to this question have largely entailed finding ways to remove confounding factors like content, context, and circumstance. We have to render some component inoperative, like knocking out a gene, and then we see what happens to the resulting creature. Shannon gets it down to probability, information, and entropy, within which any given exchange can be understood quantitatively. McLuhan makes content a distraction, oversimplifying a tiny bit, but for effect. McLuhan makes content a distraction from the medium and its effects itself. Yates and Visman, from different angles, understand how communication systems interpolate us and exert power in their structure, and not just in their written content, in ways that exceed hermeneutic analysis. And Kittler, of course, blows the hatch on the whole operation of the rich, subjective evaluation of communications objects, with a wonderfully dismissive parenthetical here, which just warms the cockles of my cold heart. An elementary datum is the fact that literature, whatever else it might mean to readers, in parentheses, processes, stores, and transmits data, and that such operations in the age-old medium of the alphabet have the same technical positivity as they do in computers. What remains to be distinguished, therefore, are not emotional dispositions, but systems. Everyone probably has already read this at some point. Whatever else it might mean to readers, all the rest of the things that literature does. So I'm oversimplifying a little bit again, but for Kittler, in a post-Shannon world, this is just a quote from Optical Media, we miss the main event of communication, the actual operation of the network of discourse, if we are distracted by people's inner lives, their fantasies of subjectivity, from close attention to the storage and transmission of data. What remains of people is what media can store and communicate, in the famous phrase of 1986. For Kittler, who is very likely the closest reader that Shannon ever had, precisely because he wasn't trying to apply him practically, the human activity was largely a distraction from the understanding of the medium itself. For Licklider, who was friends with Shannon, the danger lay in having too shallow, too depersonalized an understanding of communication. Cutting humans out of the loop was a design problem, producing models of computer networking that couldn't enrich human thinking. I will not be suggesting a reconciliation of these two perspectives, but rather that in the last 30-odd years, we have been given an opportunity to follow the concept of communication beyond them. So it'll be more about this in the last act. The communicators have to do something, Licklider and Taylor write, with the information they send and receive, something non-trivial in the mathematical sense of a trivial proof being easy, obvious, productive of, or trivial proof being easy, obvious, and productive of a shallow truth. Do two tape recorders communicate when they play to each other? Not in our sense, they write. Recall that this is in 1968. The publication of this paper is amazingly close in time to Engelbart's Mother of All Demos at the Fall Joint Computer Conference, the performance of an experience of computing structured around enabling deep human engagement across and around data. I just love that it's a grocery list of all things. We are as far from the publication of this paper, Computer as Communications Device, and as far from the Mother of All Demos as they were from the end of the First World War and the beginning of widespread civilian broadcast radio. A lot has changed. And I would assert that one of the most significant changes in that time, for our purposes today, is that for our purposes literally here today, talking about what communication is that the non-triviality of communication has become a much more complex thing to discuss, what counts as trivial and non-trivial. Because, of course, much of what structures the shape of contemporary networked life is tape recorders talking to each other. The most active areas of current digital communication, analyzed quantitatively or qualitatively, are almost entirely tape recorders in networks of exchanges for which the humans influenced are only a third or fourth order consequence. Obviously, I'm using tape recorder pretty loosely here for different forms of addressable data storage, processing, and retrieval, but it's not that far off in theory. All those of you with Macs can still run a data compression system that is named a tape archiving system from the command line in your computer. Licklider was one of the main motors with Robert Fano at MIT of something called CTSS, the Compatible Time Sharing System, an initiative to get multi-user computing off the ground, with people having remote terminals into a central mainframe. They wanted computing to feel like an invisible resource, always on, a daily utility, like electricity or water that simply exists. Note all of the tape drives in the background. They had a few problems with getting this off the ground, because this is obviously, of course, very important. This epitomizes their model of computers as collaboration devices, computers as tools for humans to communicate with other humans. One of the major problems they had was that these machines don't have clocks. So if you hit a glitch or a loop, you locked up the whole machine for everybody else who was trying to use it. And there was no mechanism that could kill a process after a few seconds. There was no way to timestamp files. So they figured out how to hook up a basic time of day clock to the machine through the printer port. So this is trivial, right? This is clearly trivial communication. It's a dumb clock to help adjust all of those dumb tape recorders. It's one of my favorite, this is to set up what's about to come. I'll let the computer nerdy joke sink in for a second. So you can already see where I'm going with this, but we've got a dumb clock that coordinates dumb tape recorders. But then you start trying to network the computers together. It's no longer people on remote terminals dialing into a central mainframe. And you get this document. This is from 1985. This is one of my favorite request for comments documents in the genesis of ARPANET and Internet. As you start networking the machines together, your clock needs become much more complex. How do you know which messages come first? What's the order in the queue? How do you make sure things aren't being resent unnecessarily? Just have everyone use a master clock. But there's transmission lag, there's mechanical failures, and several occasions in which gross errors were found in usually reliable, highly accurate clock servers after seasonal thunderstorms disrupted their primary power supply. To take a page so not only do you have to account for all those things, now your clock protocols have to compensate for seasons and thunderstorms. To take a page from Yussi's amazing book, you have to manage elemental media on a grand scale. Storms are folded into your system. And this is in 1985, September of 1985, almost 30 years ago now to the day. So it's gotten so much worse. And it's gotten much worse globally. You've got signal delays and lag. You've got clock drift from computer to computer, which is affected by things like the amount of work the machines are doing and even by heat. You need to rely on GPS to figure out how long it takes a message timestamped in one place to get to another. And GPS has to compensate for relativistic problems, for the way time passes differently outside of the Earth's gravity. One of the most impressive things, I mean, really, it's bizarre. These are Einsteinian issues that have to be accounted for just so we can make sure that packets get from place to place. One of the most impressive things Google has ever done, which is very little known, is a back-end distributed database system called Spanner. It plays a role in how you and someone who's working on a Google Doc across the world are working on the same Google Doc, that there is some consistency and identity all around the planet at scale and in real time. It also plays a major role in maintaining the accuracy of the advertising system. And Spanner is essentially a mechanism for producing a kind of what we can think of as real-timeness across the computing network. And Spanner runs something called true time at its heart. And true time, in a magnificent irony, true time is actually kind of fuzzy. The now of true time varies between 1 and 14 milliseconds long. This is what makes it possible for our present-day tape recorders to play for and record from each other. A system that has produced a new kind of temporality on a global scale, a time that includes within itself late summer thunderstorms, the curvature of Einsteinian space-time, and the complex human politics around territories and time zones that run on the layer above a new kind of now that is between 1 and 14 thousandths of a second long. A now that we, all of us, live in concert with in ways that we may not understand, any more than we understood, at the time, the new now and the new temporality taking shape in the period chronicled by Jimena Canales. This is a fantastic book about a tenth of a second and how it alters psychology, transmission of messages around, etc. This is the strange blurred now that constitutes the instant of what our gracious host has called the eternal ephemeral of living and thinking on the network. Even just at the level of timing, then, of synchronizing and keeping state between our tape recorders, something of great richness and complexity is happening. This title turns out to be true in precisely the opposite sense than Licklider and Taylor meant it. The computer is a communications device, and the communicators are doing something non-trivial with the information that they send and receive. It's just that very, very few of the communicators are actually people. The human contributions are, in fact, more useful in aggregate, as fodder for deep learning systems, predictive text algorithms, and, as was mentioned, but maybe in a slightly different way, translation engines, than as the outcomes of any individual activity. Ken Wark has talked about the unexpected side of the collapse of privacy on the network, that aside from terrifying targeted Orwellian violations of personal autonomy for small numbers of dissidents, activists, and minorities worldwide, everyone else is treated with the utmost indifference, with a kind of fascinating data-driven indifference, because your individual identity is in many ways the least interesting thing about you for purposes of demographic production, advertising, even policing. The Ashley Madison hack, seen in this light, is rather sweetly archaic. The emphasis on one-on-one shame and extortion for pursuing an affair, even if the other party in the affair was only a crudely generated fembot profile. It's sort of like the Renaissance Fair or colonial Williamsburg. It's a place where you can see artisanal blackmail the way it used to be done, back when things like that still mattered. So if we are talking about the computer as a communications device, about the concept, the term of communication on our contemporary networks mediated by digital systems, then surely we should talk about social media. And I love following the previous panel because I think these things connect in interesting ways. But if we're going to talk with any clarity about social media, we of course need to talk about what's actually happening quantitatively there. And the kind of activity that Licklider and Taylor are seeking, active participants with minds interacting, is playing a smaller and smaller role. So there's spam, of course. Lots and lots of spam, increasingly sophisticated in its resemblance to human activity. But operating on a far larger and more complex scale than spammers, or organizations like JTRIG in the UK and Operation Earnest Voice in the US, which seek to analyze, manage, manipulate, and disrupt online conversation through several methods, most notably the mass generation of personae, bots doesn't quite do them justice, that can engage in online social activity. They can shift sentiments, quietly spread propaganda, amplify messages, give the impression of trending or significant topics, game online polls, or simply flood a conversation that would otherwise be potentially significant with irrelevancies, noise, and fight starting. This is what is called in the trade information operations work. And the really significant thing here is that these personae may not necessarily be artificial. They may or may not be conversation engines running on a big, deep learning feature set. There may indeed be humans on the other end of the keyboard, as in the case of Putin's amazing troll factory, which has huge coordinated teams that work 24 hours a day disrupting online conversations about Ukraine and Syria and manipulating public opinion in interesting, somewhat complex ways. Or, as was fantastically discussed by Lisa yesterday, Gamergate, where there's a mix of automated bot systems and human users. I'm speeding along because we started a little late just to get through some of this. And human users who take advantage of their innate human capability for bullying, cruelty, and time wasting to drive women off, out of gaming and off of the internet. Now, the really salient point here is that it doesn't matter if it's a human or a machine communicating, quote unquote. The goal of really good software development in this space is to make them functionally indistinguishable. I'll just allude here briefly to Lily Irani's fantastic work on Amazon Mechanical Turk and the amount of work that Amazon goes through to make the human workers as much like dealing with machines as possible. So you don't need to think of yourself as dealing with people. Seen in a certain light, Cyril's Chinese room looks just like a kind of knowledge worker factory floor. The gap keeps narrowing between social network bots and what Anab Jain calls meat puppets. It's her term for people who join an internet discussion solely to influence it, and more broadly, how we can be understood as livestock for producing information, propagating memes, responding to automated notifications, and in other ways, being the felt glove with the glue-on googly eyes on the limb of a vast and intricate machine. Just as the gap has narrowed and narrowed between content farms, between the writing of interns at content farms who are snorting crushed up Adderall and knocking out content in response to metrics, and software that does precisely the same thing except with no need for bathroom breaks or amphetamine. So all the rest of us, in a way that I think may connect interesting with the discourse around proletarianization, seen the gradual diminution of whatever it is that makes us human on the network in particular, and gives our communications some kind of special property. I'm actually going to skip the next two slides. I'd be happy to discuss them afterwards because we're a little short on time, that have to do with the degree to which in early telephonic history, you always find the instruction, which I love, to remind you to talk to the person and not to the telephone, because people were not audible because they were trying to talk to the phone rather than to the person on the other end. And that now increasingly we talk to the phones. The phones, in fact, are able to have quite complex and sophisticated sorts of conversations with us. Now, all that I've told you so far seems like the confirmation of some rather old news. Turing's landmark argument from various disabilities, as he calls it, in Computing, Machinery, and Intelligence. Turing's argument in favor of the possibility of computers having minds can be crudely summarized as, if you think the machines are dumb, you should see the people. The argument builds on the assumption that machines can't be thinking because it is a special property of humanness. To which Turing responds, well, in what ways do you evaluate whether other people, or indeed you yourself, are talking? And this intriguingly connects with the first talk today as well, or are thinking. Take that set of criteria, apply it to everything, and see what passes. This is a way of eliminating what Reza Negarestani has wonderfully called the straw machine argument. Hence the imitation game, also known as the Turing test, which I want to mention here specifically to clarify that we pass this test in small, constrained ways in the real world constantly now. People give up their credit cards to seductive interaction designs. The programs which need to distinguish human users from all kinds of bots are in terribly difficult straits. This is a dashboard for a service that lets you hire humans just to fill out the automated CAPTCHA systems to distinguish humans from bots. And even a living, breathing human user can effectively be a bot or functionally indistinguishable from one. This is to say nothing of far more advanced systems, some of which already exist and some of which are coming in the near future. So I'll level with you that this is where my talk is drawing towards a close, and this is where it's either going to wrap up spectacularly or just go totally off the rails. Because I've had about 20 minutes to make the case for why we need to reevaluate, as is the theme of this conference, the term communication in light of contemporary technologies. Talking about communication is something that humans do, with all those cloudy positive terms, is kind of a dead end for this purpose. Ignoring all of that subjective human content was very useful for cracking codes and creating ways of seeing media at the level of systems of discourse. It was a salutary correction to our tendency to be so inward focused. But this method likewise has its limits. So both the Licklider path and the Kittler path have, I would argue, their limits for looking at our contemporary communications architectures, particularly given that those systems are now increasingly predicated on abstracting the most subjective, intimate parts of human experience, whether sentiment analysis, facial expression, or the property of text being interesting, into further fodder for the process. We are in the process of building deeply alien architectures and systems on a vast scale, whose content we partially constitute. And it is in the context of those systems that we communicate now. In political thought and analysis, we have still not cut off the head of the king, Foucault famously wrote. Whereas, at the risk of being a little cute, I'm worried that in media analysis, we still think the king has a head. The king is not for some considerable time. We have deep, rich theories about how we communicate with non-humans of all kinds, from Lucy Suchman's Situated Actions, Donna Haraway's Companion Species, biosemiotics, and so on. I assert that we have not yet really come to grips with the alienness of our contemporary systems and those now coming online, for which we lack any significant precedent, and that we need new theoretical models for understanding them. By alien here, I do not, of course, mean merely different from us, as we would say of a dog or a starfish or a sycamore. The work of communicating with aliens is precisely the work of communicating with an entity which is for present purposes unknowable. We beam a signal that will take decades or centuries to reach a distant star, with no prior understanding of their biology or sensory anatomy, much less of their symbol systems or their instruments or the nature of their cognition. So what, then, do we communicate? We can set aside projects that are, at heart, meant to connect with other humans, of which my personal favorite was actually the first broadcast to an extraterrestrial form of life, a test of the Yevpatoria antenna in Crimea, which was just a Morse code version of Mir, USSR, and Lenin, which I'm sure, really connected with the Venusians. And there have been numerous projects proposed by many people prior to the arrival of electronic broadcast media for forms of alien communication that were basically visual. So Gauss proposed using reflecting mirrors. The wonderful Charles Cros, the great poet of nonsense and figure in the In the French avant-garde, who's largely remembered solely for being the also-ran in a number of major media breakthroughs, spent quite a lot of time thinking about how to communicate by flashes with beings on Mars, in the course of which he invented the system of run-length encoding, which is what we use to transmit faxes. And I mention this because it leads to the first of 2 points with which I'll close. The process of trying to develop formats, rules, systems, and messages for communicating with other entities that are fundamentally unknowable turns out to be very closely connected with many problems in computing and telecommunications. When you think about it, the ultimate test case for signal transmission, a very noisy channel, extremely limited means, a message that needs to include its own means of encoding, verification, and display, is trying to send something through space to an unknown form of life. The theoretical problem turns out to share a great deal with problems of dealing with computers. This is from the totally entertaining study Astroglossa by the zoologist and statistician Lancelot Hogben from 1952. Lancelot Hogben. It's an awesome person. And all of the questions that he raises, what are the challenges of fundamental communication? How do you point at things? How do you create a common space for semantic reference? All of those communication models need to start with understanding whatever the primitives are that can structure the minimal statements that will allow communication to take place. And Hogben, from this, quickly leaps into the question of how it is that we are going to interact with the new electronic computation machines. And this brings us to what I would like to close with, again, sort of accelerating a little bit, just since we started a little late. The process that Hogben is dealing with is that of trying to figure out how to address an unknown system by creating a very specific format that will allow that message to come across, by finding out what the primitives are that will allow you to start with natural numbers and then eventually arrive at something like, say, morality or expressions of philosophical commitments. And indeed, one of the crucial figures in this history, the amazing mathematician Hans Freudenthal, produced a volume 1, volume 2 never came into being for perhaps obvious reasons, of a book called Linkos, which was going to be a new, wholly logical language for communicating with extraterrestrial life entirely through binary pulses. And the beauty of Linkos is that it starts with natural numbers, gets into talking about space and time, and then has 73 pages in which we use the system to send plays to aliens that express human concepts of morality in the form of philosophical dialogues between 2 characters named H.A. and H.B. They mostly talk about math. And that impulse, not simply to find out how to communicate a number system and then use that as the basis for an exchange, that impulse leads to the second point that I hope is somewhat more profound and the one with which I will close. Studying formats for extraterrestrial communication is a starting point for addressing the problems I discussed at the beginning of this talk, because it necessarily forces a reevaluation of the bundle of human biases, bodily assumptions, cognitive habits, arrangements of language, and what constitutes meaningfulness that shape our concepts of what communication is. It demands of us that we have to think through in great detail how it is that we conceive of things like time, and how it is that we address other kinds of entities. I'm not saying that these communications projects have solved that, have produced a mode of truly inhuman communication, but that they force dimensions of that analysis which might otherwise escape us. Areas of anthropomorphism in communication that we need to reevaluate more urgently than ever, not because we are necessarily on the verge of dialogue with Gliese 581 on the screen here, but because we are building our own alien orders, and they observe us through satellites, webcams, our search queries, and indeed the data that we produce with almost every aspect of our lives. J.G. Ballard famously said that Earth is the only alien planet, and we are in the process of building entities, non-biological forms, for that alien planet to join us here. And I suspect a major part of understanding communication in the future is going to be coming to the limits of what we can do as humans and figuring out how to live in closer dialogue with aliens. So thank you very much for your attention.